Welcome to Property Quorum. Well, as per usual, we're joined by the stalwarts of Property Quorum. That's Hamish, Mclay of Search Convey, Chris Gelsenan of Route Home, Zahrah Aullybocus of Next Law, of course, Juliet Baboolal of Gunner Cook. Now, we often talk about things that are both hard to pronounce and hard to discuss. But today, we're going to talk about leasehold limits. Is it a broken model or is it the mindset that's gone? And as per usual, I'm throwing Hamish under the bus.
Well, I think it must be the mindset with me. There's this sort of strange thing, because I recollect going back many years ago now that buying a car by way of lease was a very sensible way of doing things, because, or it could be, depending on the lease, of course. However, what happened, you'd actually buy the car through the lease. At the end of the lease, you owned the car. Fantastic thing. Nice and straightforward. Now, what you do, however, it seems to me, and I'm sure some of our knowledgeable folk here will be able to tell us about it, as regards leasehold on a property, what you actually do, instead of paying off the lease, you keep extending it almost indefinitely. And we have, what are we speaking about, 1,000-year leases now, as well as sort of 100-year leases? And I don't quite know how that works, because it almost seems, because that way the lease is never paid off, surely.
All right. Well, Juliet, is it true that now we are waiting for the next iteration of human beings, i.e. 1,000 years' time, before the lease is up? It seems a bit crazy to me.
But it's always worked that way. I mean, what Hamish is talking about is a 999-year lease, which is deemed as virtual freehold. So obviously, it's not going to expire in the lifetime of the original lessee. So the intention is for it to pass on. I mean, to other generations. There is the opportunity to buy the freehold, which is always recommended when you can, so that you've got control. There's the opportunity to have the right to manage, so you can manage the development as you wish. But what you find is that the leases have gone wild, so to speak, because of freeholders who know the system, who are paying lawyers to get the best interest for them. So you've got this doubling ground rent, which potentially makes your lease into a short haul tenancy. And so you can be evicted if you haven't complied with one of the covenants. You've got the issues in terms of lack of mortgagee protection, and some mortgagees just wouldn't touch a bank or a lender will not touch the lease if there's no protection clause. So you've got freeholders or developers who are not being held accountable for the type of lease that's being issued. You should not be able to issue a lease where someone's paid you a premium and they're able to lose that lease for silly things. Yes, you should be able to police it, but you shouldn't make a profit twice. So you're getting a consideration for this lease, but yet you're charging all of these other things that just absolutely make no sense. And I think that's where the system is flawed. But unfortunately, people see leasehold and no one wants to dissect it. In fact, they're conveyancers who just wouldn't even touch leasehold because they don't even understand it themselves. So the reality is, I think when we had older leases, they were defective because there were lack of clauses in there. But now we've got newer leases and they're defective insofar as they're onerous on the person purchasing. So where do we strike that balance? You know, you've got to get some guidance in place where the people, the freeholders, the ones granting the new leases, one, need to adhere to, and two, any variations on existing leases, there needs to be some guidance, because even when you approach a freeholder for a variation, the price to get that variation is also quite hefty. So the burden always seems to be on the lessee. Of course, it's their security, it's their assets, and they've got to protect it. But where is the balance? How do we get freeholders accountable for granting, leases that are sort of market standard, that aren't onerous to a lessee?
It does seem a little bit crazy. Zahrah, is it Joker's wild and leases wild, in fact?
Yeah, I completely agree with Juliet. And what I've come to discover is that a lease is an agreement entirely one-sided in favour of the landlord. And if you're a leaseholder, you break any of the rules, you stand to lose your property. The landlord makes a windfall because they can sell it and keep the difference. Which is why a lot of lenders are looking for these mortgagee protection clauses so that they can get their money back. But it's still hit and miss to get these clauses. But also you've got the use of leasehold as complex legal structures to make it more difficult for people to acquire their freeholds. But also it's going to be an education piece moving to common hold. Just because you can manage your own building doesn't mean it costs any less, but you must take care of it. Otherwise, your building's going to fall into disrepair and then it'll make it even harder for you to sell. And at the end of the day, this is all a people problem. It's all about, ensuring people get on with one another and what to do if there's a dispute.
Oh, wow. Well, Chris, it's going to be so much easier when it's just AI doing all the work, isn't it?
Zahrah makes a really, really interesting point there. Yeah, she's absolutely right about it being an education piece. And we've had some properties that we've come along and acquired or looked at acquiring, and the management company that's meant to be running the maintenance and upkeep of the property are just an utter joke. So there's all sorts of challenges with the management companies in the current leasehold setup. I was surprised to learn this morning after doing a bit of research, because I know Hamish keeps poking me about common hold, and hands up, I honestly didn't know very much about it. I was surprised to learn that it's been around in this country since 2002, which was quite staggering. And looking around and the comparisons between the two different structures, I fully agree. Leasehold is very onerous. It's very one-sided. It's almost like a trap. And we now have a whole series of investors that are overseas, and one of the questions that comes up on a regular basis is it freehold? Is it freehold? Because they're terrified of leasehold. They just don't want to get into it, knowing that it is a minefield. So yeah, I fully agree that there needs to be some sort of reform. And having looked at common hold this morning, and it looks like it does give complete ownership and complete control to the people who are living in that building or really owning that building. And I think that's really important, because it gives people a sense of pride, of attachment to something, and maybe they do want to be responsible for the upkeep of their building, just like a freeholder would be. So yeah, it makes sense in a lot of different ways. But there is this education piece that is going to have to happen, where people need to take responsibility for the building that they're operating in. But I think that's I think there are a lot of people who would want that. And while the owners of each common hold would be effectively a shareholder in the entire structure of the operation, they wouldn't necessarily have to take an active part in the operation of the common hold association. So there's different ways of looking at it, and different levels of interaction and involvement that different people could have. But I think in my view, it seems like a very sensible solution. Like I say, quite surprising it's been around for that 23 or so years. And if the government is serious about doing reforms, I think it needs to make a clear pathway for transitioning leaseholds to common holds, although there is going to be one hell of a resistance from the freeholders.
Juliet, so is common hold the silver bullet everyone's looking for?
I've been exposed to common hold not just in the UK but in Italy, because that's the way all of the flats operate and they work. But it's a cultural thing. I mean, if you live at a property, then that's your pride and joy, and you want it to be taken care of. The sort of personal interest that you're going to have vested in it will be different from a managing agent. So I do think it's a good thing, but there needs to be, as Chris says and as Zahrah says, there needs to be education around it and clear guidelines, because somehow what tends to happen is there's a misinterpretation of certain things and it gets to court, it gets litigated, it becomes messy. and it doesn't need to be if we're clear. And so these guidelines need to be set by people who understand the process, understand the effects of certain things, so that there's no gray area. We understand what we're getting into. It's a clearer path for the solicitors as well. In fact, I saw somewhere where it said, if your solicitor hasn't advised you about how onerous the ground rent is, then go after their PI. And these things really peeve me off, because I'm like, yes, the solicitor is supposed to advise you on what you're getting yourself into. And they may tell you, look, the ground rent is doubling, and it's for you to accept whether that's onerous to you or not, but everything seems to be, let's go after the solicitor for the PI. So the point I'm saying is, and PI is professional indemnity insurance. Yeah. The point I'm making is, if you have clear guidelines, the solicitors will adhere to those guidelines. But what you've got is everything's open to interpretation. You decide what it is until there's case law. So you could be wrong until someone gets to court and there's a judgment. And even then, that judgment can be overruled. So I do think common hold is a good thing if done well, because I've seen it work. But there needs to be, very clear guidelines in relation to that.
Zahrah, it's been messaging behind the scenes, and it seems, sorry, no, Zahrah, this is a good point. Short-term pain for long-term gain. The one thing that you said to me in your private message was that most of these buildings don't last 60 years.
Well, we've discovered that on cladding matters, haven't we, Gareth?
Yes.
New properties being built, that are, have sign-offs that aren't worth a piece of paper they're written on.
Well, they seem to have made a lot of them of string and hope.
There's a little dangerous ground here where, these properties are going to be built and shoved off to the Common Hold Association, but you then got a Common Hold Association that's not separately represented, where the due diligence is not being done in terms of what certificates, what standards have been adhered to by the developer on common areas. So, you could still have the issues of, substandard infrastructure being put in. You've got all these Section 106 agreements asking for parks and things like that to be maintained. And it's all, all of that is going to be landed on the Common Hold Association, along with all these new building safety requirements. So, the cost is going up and up and up and up. But if we can get an understanding, these functions can still be outsourced to professional agents, and that there is still a need for professional agents to help people do this. It's not the end of the world, but if we can get that right, then, as Juliet says, the pride in looking after your building is there, and people will pay for it if they know if they have that understanding. And as Juliet says, I've seen it work well in other countries. But same with Australia. They've still got issues with dodgy developers handing over these properties. And it's just, the government need to sort out the builders and also get the lenders on board, because I've seen very, very good residents-run companies. I was able to get a leasehold purchase through in 6 weeks last year, on the basis that the information was all there from the residents-run company.
Wow.
And they
6 weeks.
Yet they were quick in answering all my questions. It's not to say everything was perfect. I asked lots of questions. We went back and forth. I had a good solicitor on the other side. I had it done in 6 weeks.
Chris, given that most new builds are made of tissue paper, string and hope, it just seems to me that there could be an issue with getting mortgage lenders to want to actually go ahead with one thing, because they're going to want to look at this thing with their spyglass, aren't they?
You raise a couple of really good and interesting points there.
I have to say, hang on, before you say anything, these weren't my points. This is from Zahrah.
Zahrah raised them.
There you go.
Well done, Zahrah. Not so well done, Gareth. I also found this morning, after looking through again, going back to the Common Hold stuff, that there seems to be a bit of a reluctance from lenders to lend, which is part of the reason why the uptake hasn't happened. it would seem that there's a perceived risk, and it's more of a risk of an unknown of what or how the building is going to be managed.
Right.
So yeah, there are some interesting nuances to this, and it does come down to lending. It does come down to lendability. But to go back to your original point, if the buildings are made of chewing gum, I mean, and they're signed off, then that's fraud. So at some point, someone needs to be going after these developers.
Well, there's no such thing as fraud in the property industry. I mean, never heard of such a thing. Hamish, it seems to me that there's a perfectly good mechanism here, but that lenders themselves, the mortgage providers, are reticent, which means it's not taken up.
I think we have another situation that all the people aren't speaking to each other to understand fully what's going on. And both Juliet and Zahrah have pointed out that it's very, very much a mindset thing as to whether this common hold idea would actually sort of work. It works effectively in Italy. It works effectively in many parts of Australia. One of the interesting things, when we get these comparisons as to what's going on abroad, we very rarely hear of the downside. People will turn around and say, oh, this has been working in Australia perfectly well. Why aren't we doing what they're doing in Australia? But that's because companies based in Australia are trying to sell it to us in the UK, their concepts, their ideas, and make money out of what we're actually sort of doing. They make enough money out of what goes on in conveyancing anyway, but they're trying to switch. It is that level of understanding. And I think Chris quite rightly pointed out, who knows what they're getting themselves into with this. It's unproven again. And I think we have a very, very difficult sort of situation here. We have a government, I still believe they have a good intent. They do want to get the houses out there. They do want to improve the situation. However, there are an awful lot of complexities. We saw it with the Building Safety Act with the previous government. Oh, here's a good idea. However, that good idea carries with it so much undercurrent that you just haven't noticed. And I think this is a challenge that we've got at the moment. It's not something we can rush into hastily, but it's definitely an all-party discussion. It's not just an all-party discussion from a political perspective, but it's also very much a collaboratory thing between what is going on legally, the legal side of it. And of course, it's the legal side and the financial side. And of course, this is something that Juliet's very close to, because it's not, it depends who, in fact, is going to be lending that particular money for it. Is it going to be from the development sort of side of things? Is it going to be from the mortgage side of things, from the property owner? The complexities are way, way beyond this wee brain of mine. So I think I'd quite like to sort of leave it with the experts. When I speak to Zahrah and when I speak to Juliet about some of the things that they have to do, the brain gets frazzled. It's just, let them look at it. Let them look at it.
Well, it does appear to me that what appears to be common is quite uncommon. And even after 20 years of it, there still doesn't appear to be enough evidence as to its success for lenders to roll over and allow us to tickle their exposed under parts. But however, I do believe if we keep pushing through, this seems to be not necessarily a silver bullet, but a better way of working. I suppose over time, only time will tell. Thank you so much for your great words and amazing insights. Juliet Baboolal of Gelsenan, Zahrah Aullybocus of Nexus Law, and of course Chris Gelsenan of Root Home, not forgetting our esteemed Lord and Master Hamish Mclay of Search and Convey. And to all of you watching there, we just got to keep pushing through with this thing. I absolutely believe all the information's out there. It's just about communication, as ever. Until next time, thank you very much for being with us. Keep your feet on the ground, keep reaching for the stars, and try and look after that mental health. Bye-bye now.